Okay, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to week 2. We're going to be talking about layouts and Bootstrap today. Just before we begin, is it too dark in here? Is anyone going to fall asleep on me? We're all good? Okay, perfect. All right, so today's schedule, quite a bit of stuff to do. We're going to start out with some cool links and resources. So I typically like to start my classes this way. So just things that would be of interest to you. They might be related to CSS, they might not. If you come across any resources that you think the class would benefit from seeing, feel free to send those to me via email, and I will include those in my list. We're going to do a quick review from last week. We're going to take a look at that challenge that you had to do. I apologize, I wasn't super clear about that. That was just a challenge for your own learning. It wasn't an official lab or assignment. So throughout the semester, there will be sort of those independent learning activities. They're not always necessarily going to be a lab or 4 marks. They're just kind of a way for you to practice. But anytime you do have a lab, which heads up, you do have a lab today, I will be very clear about how you will submit it. So don't worry about that. We're going to talk about our module 2 objectives, which is all about layouts. We're going to get to know Bootstrap, and I feel like I've asked this before, but how many of you have used Bootstrap before? Anybody? A couple? Cool. So we're gonna get to know Bootstrap. If you are familiar with it, you're kind of ahead of the game. But if not, we're gonna start right from the basics: what Bootstrap is, how we can use it, and then we're gonna use Bootstrap to create layouts. And then we will end with Lab 1. So Cool Stuffs is up first. The first link is a CSS lint. So if you've used a JavaScript lint before, basically it just kind of helps you write better code. So in this case, apparently this linter is brutally honest. It might hurt your feelings, but also help you code better. So what you do, you paste your CSS in there, and it kind of it tells you your mistakes. It makes suggestions about sort of optimizing your CSS. Might hurt your feelings, I don't know, but it is a great tool to help you write better code. So that is csslint.net. So you might want to try that out today. The other one, the next one, is kind of the same thing, just another version of a linter for CSS. So basically, it's mighty, apparently, because it understands the latest CSS syntax. It extracts embedded styles from HTML, because we know that's not cool. Parses CSS-like syntax. It has over 170 built-in rules. Supports plugins. Fixes some violations automatically. That's cool. Well-tested, unopinionated, apparently, and a growing community. So again, you would just paste your CSS somewhere, or maybe it's a download, I'm not sure, and then it would tell you how to write better CSS. So it gives you some hints for writing good CSS. All right, next up. So as you know, in the world of web development and front-end development, things change all the time. It's kind of hard to stay up to date with everything, but we have to try. So this you might be aware of. These are CSS logical properties and values. So this is kind of newer. I hadn't heard of this. Maybe you have. But it's a new way to sort of set properties. So I will not read this to you, but take a look at that. It's some good stuff. And again, it's a way to stay up to date with newer things that are coming at you. This MDN Web Docs is always a good resource. I would bookmark that site or keep that site in mind. It's a good way to stay up to date with lots of cool stuff. Alrighty, a couple more to share with you. One more. Did we do that one? Yeah, we did. This is also a really awesome site if you haven't come across this yet. So this is csstricks.com. So it's done by a guy named Chris Coyer. I don't know how to say his last name. He's awesome. He's like the CSS master. And so it has lots of cool stuff. It has articles that you can stay up to date with new stuff. It's a lot of tutorials, how-tos. We've got videos. If you like to watch videos, that's cool. So things like hand SVGing a curved line. Sounds pretty cool. How to think like a front-end developer. Learning to integrate visual testing with Percy. So lots of different topics and lots of different videos as well. So there's also an almanac. I'm not really sure what that would be. Oh, it looks like, oh, that's nice. So just defining different style rules, properties, that kind of thing. And then snippets, we all like snippets, right? And this looks cool. So we're definitely going to come back to this when we talk about Flexbox and Grid, because this is a great guide to both. So if you want to get sort of a sneak peek at Flexbox, if you're not familiar with it, I would recommend taking a look at this. It's as it says, comprehensive guide. It is really comprehensive. It does a good job of explaining Flexbox in easy terms with some nice diagrams if you're a visual learner. So it makes Flexbox quite easy to understand. And then same thing with Grid. So they've got their complete guide to Flexbox and their complete guide to Grid. And then after that, lots of other cool stuff. So very common stuff, smooth scrolling. That's something a lot of websites add. It looks a lot better than just, sort of jumping to the next section. So CSS grid starter layouts. So lots of cool stuff there as well. So take a look at that too. And then maybe just check out guides. So again, there's some good guides as well. All right, so that's cool stuff. Again, if you come across something cool you think the class would benefit from seeing, just send it over and I'll include it in my list for the week. So before we skip ahead to today's topic, let's see what you remember from last week. So last week we were kind of introducing the course. We were talking about, what were we talking about? Who can remind me? It seems like a long time ago, but it was only a week. What did we cover last week? Anyone remember? Boilerplate, yes. What is boilerplate? Kind of hard to define. So it's I believe it's a framework. It's always hard to remember what they refer to themselves as. Let's take a look. Boilerplate, web dev. Oh, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So we looked at HTML5 and it is a template. So they're calling it a template. It is a framework. It's apparently the web's most popular front-end template. So it basically provided us with a nice foundation to get our web project started. So when we looked at that, and I'll open up the code from last week. So we downloaded this package and just kind of poked around there. Lots of stuff that was included already that we didn't really have to think about, which was nice. That gets us going nice and quickly. Everything is nicely organized. So we talked about the importance of kind of being organized with our files, organized with our CSS, so kind of breaking things into pieces. What else? So it includes things like robots.txt. And if you open that up, you'll see that's basically, you use a .text, a robots text file, if you want to prevent search engines from crawling certain pages on your site for some reason. And so right now it's set up to allow all, but if you wanted to change that, you could just go into that file and change that to what you need. So same thing, it's got a web manifest file, it's got humans.txt that you can write notes, a 404 page already built in, and then it's got plugins.js, main.js is set up for you to write your own custom JavaScript, and then CSS, so this is my CSS, but it did come built in with normalize.css. Who can remind me what normalize.css does for us? Yes.
Removes the browser styles.
Yeah, so it doesn't sort of wipe them out completely. So there's something called a reset. I think it's reset.css that just kind of blows everything away. So you're starting from scratch. It kind of just fixes the really not so great default styles, and sort of across the board, across all browsers, just makes everything a little more similar. All right, so that's cool. So what I asked you to do for your little challenge that wasn't actually a lab was to create a sort of a 2-column layout. So if we go back to week 1, here's our challenge here. So what you were asked to do, just for practice to get used to boilerplate and the idea of, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but we talked about how it's a good idea to use a modular approach when you're using CSS. What do I mean by a modular approach? Sure, yeah.
Have devoted files for each call category of styles, and technology would be one.
Yeah.
I can't really think of colors, maybe another one.
Yeah. Yeah, you're kind of splitting, yeah, it's kind of hard to explain, but you're splitting your CSS up into sort of logical sections. So yeah, typography, you're going to create a separate typography.css file, if that makes sense for you. Maybe you have layout.css for all your layout styles, and it's just a, well, wait, I'm not going to say that. Why do we do this? Why does modular approach make sense? What's the point of breaking things up and separating them? Yes.
Well, as you see, combine certain elements without necessarily including the rest of your CSS. You can have different layouts for certain pages, but your typography styles the same.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, it's allowing us to sort of optimize our CSS, make our code a little drier. We're not repeating ourselves. And that's why when we use this modular approach, we wouldn't want to create a separate CSS file for each page, because it's likely that we'd be repeating ourselves. So we'd have the same typography styles on each CSS file. We'd have the same layout. So it makes more sense to kind of break it up in components. So that was your challenge. So you were going to use HTML5 boilerplate and a modular approach to your CSS and create a one-page website that follows the layout demonstrated right here. So you got a big image at the top, text, and then a footer with 3 columns. So I actually didn't, when I did this challenge on my own, I didn't do the image, but that's okay, we'll talk about that. You're going to style all your H1 titles as 40 pixels, bold centered. Style all text as 14 pixels with line height of 16. If you wanted to use M's or Rems, that would be totally cool as well, probably a better idea. Style the first paragraph in the first section as italic font. Style all footer text as 12 pixels with line height of 14. And then that footer is going to have a background color of BAD855, because that's a great color. So that was your challenge. So kind of combining the idea of using boilerplate as well as a modular approach to your CSS. So I'll show you what I came up with. I'm just realizing now that I totally didn't follow the layout that I gave you. That's okay. So if I open it up, yeah, it doesn't follow it at all, but I'll show you what I did. So I went with a 2-column layout, and what I decided to do, if I look in my CSS file, I've separated things. This made sense to me to separate my layout and my typography, because they would be sort of common throughout. I only have one page, but if I had multiple pages, those would have common styles throughout. And then the main CSS file, so that was the file that actually came with the HTML5 boilerplate package. I included just sort of general styles in the author's custom style section. So there wasn't actually too many there. You'll see I did something with the image. I just set that to width 100%, height auto, centered it, made sure it was displaying as a block level element, and then set a border radius of 25%. And then I just decided to set a background color for the whole page. So that looks like that. And then for my layout, actually typography first, just putting all my typography styles in one file. So defining the font family, font size. I've included colors as well. And then finally, the layout. And you'll notice that I used floats. How many of you used floats for this challenge? Probably none of you, because you're smart, right? So floats, it works, obviously. Is it the best way to do things? No, it's not. So floats are kind of an older way that we used to create layouts. It works, but it's not really intended for that. A float is meant for content to float around another item. It's not meant to construct layouts, but it has been used in that way. So I did that. I used floats. Who wants to share with me how they constructed their layout? What did you use instead of floats? Dan.
Grid with Flexbox.
Grid with Flexbox. Interesting. Why did you combine both?
I find with grid it's a lot easier to arrange your sections.
Okay.
And then you just set each section to Flexbox.
Okay, cool.
As you go down, it automatically.
Right, so you probably have some kind of responsiveness built in already, whereas my floats, you can see, not so much. Although I did set sort of not a fixed width. I use percentages for the width, so we've kind of got somewhat responsive, but not really at all. Cool. Did anyone else do something different to construct their layout that they'd like to share? So really no one used floats? I like that. That's good. Good stuff. Would anyone else like to share how they did the layout? No. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do, so obviously float's not the way to go. CSS Grid is awesome. Flexbox is awesome. And there's lots of other tools available. Well, not lots, but there's a few. What we're going to talk about today is actually using Bootstrap to create our layouts. So that's where we're going. So let's talk about layouts first. What a layout is, I'm sure you know, but it is a pattern or framework that defines a website structure. It's really one of the most important elements of a good user interface. So that was one of the other things we talked about last week. We looked at some really bad examples that were not so great, and then we looked at good examples of a user interface. And having a good layout that makes sense really does help to create a good user interface. So layouts, they help websites not only look good, they're visually appealing, but it also helps users navigate and find information, and they're also intuitive if they're good. But bad layouts, they're frustrating to the users, which can mean that users quickly leave your page, which is bad for many reasons. Not only is that bad for your SEO, it's bad for your business if your users are leaving your page really quickly. So we want to make sure that we are using layouts that are good and that make sense. So there is a strong link between our layout and our user engagement. That is a copy. How can we use an effective layout? So which layout do you choose? It kind of depends on your goals for the website. So if you want to be bold and memorable, you might use a layout that's sort of different, that doesn't really follow the normal layout that most websites follow. But if you want to be a little more mainstream and you really want to encourage your users to do some action, you might use a layout that's been proven to help them sort of navigate and convert them to do that action. So a few common layouts we're going to look at before we talk about building our own layouts. This comes from this site. This does a really good job. We'll take a quick look at this article. So this does a really good job about talking about what a layout is, why it's important, getting familiar with the layout design best practices. So it even gets into a little bit of sort of design theory like visual weight through negative space, balance, and so on. And then it goes through specific types of goals as well as the different types of layouts. So we're going to look at a few layouts together. Okay, so this one's super common. You've probably seen it a million times, the Z framework. So basically what it does is it encourages users to kind of scan the page. So what it does, the way it's laid out, just naturally your eyes move along the page following a Z direction. So starting at the very top, to the side, down, and then to the other side. So really, really common. You'll start to, once you've sort of thought about it, now that you look at websites, you'll start to see it everywhere, that Z pattern. And it's good for really a variety of goals and websites. So it is sort of a common pattern, but it's really good for sort of guiding your user's eye the way you want it to go. So maybe you have something really important. Well, obviously your logo is probably here. Maybe there's like a contact button here, and then maybe your CTA here and another CTA there, something like that. You can just kind of guide your user on the page in that pattern. There's also something called the F layout. It's kind of hard to see, but that is a heat map. So you can apply that on your website. You can add a tool that will create a heat map to see where your user's attention is focused. So this is the heat map for this site, and you can see that it's sort of an F pattern, right? So we have, there we go, there's our F, like that. And so instead of your users moving their eyes along in a Z pattern, it's more of an F shape. So again, you might use that for specific things. It looks like from this site, it looks like users probably are scanning the navigation items, then looking at the first article that's featured, and then maybe taking a look at the second article. So it depends, again, on your goals, what you want to do. Pretty common layout. Then we have the full screen photo, also pretty common, more and more common today for sure. So just a big full screen image, then you usually have some kind of caption, and then typically you would have some kind of CTA button encouraging your users to do something. So either learn more, sign up, whatever the case may be. So the text sections or menu sections are there to support the living image. What this is good for, it's good to use for websites that want to immediately anchor the subject of a site in the mind of the visitor. So they always say that pictures are worth 1,000 words. I think that's the saying. So really, you can basically tell the story just with that really strong image, and then text is almost secondary in this layout. Grid layout. So everyone is familiar with YouTube. They use a grid layout. This is good when you have lots of information. It's nice and easily organized. It allows for easy navigation, equal distribution of photos, text, etc. And again, you can also break things into categories. So when you have lots of information, such as YouTube, this is a good way to just organize and show that information in an easy way for your users. One column layout, a little bit boring, not as exciting as the other ones. Everything is in one column, as the name suggests. It is super easy to create, which is nice for developers. Easy to navigate and read, which is nice for users. It sort of has that minimalistic look, which is always sort of on trend. But it's basically good for things like blogs, longer articles. So in sort of opposition to the full screen photo, this time the text is really telling the story. So for sites or web pages that have a lot of text, this might be the way to go, the one column layout. Featured image, this is very popular as well. So it involves setting up a featured image representative of each page in the website. The image serves to not concatenate, sorry. Concentrate attention and interest to a focal point expressive of the page topic. So here's a good example here. This is a nice portfolio site, and they have a featured image. And then if you would scroll down, they would have a feature image that represents each section of the site. All right, cool. So we know all the different types of layouts now. There's even more. If you check out that article, the link that I included at the start, they talk about a few more common layouts. So if you want to check that out, that would be good. So let's talk about how we create these layouts. We know that we use HTML to describe the content, but that doesn't do anything as far as rendering that content. So we can call CSS, that's what we use. And what we're going to do is, oh, I forgot my next slide. So the next slide was enter Bootstrap, because that's what we're going to, unless I mixed up the order. Yeah, I did. All right, well, that's fine. So talking more about layouts before we talk about Bootstrap. So no matter what sort of interface you are building, whether it's a CMS, a template for a CMS, a control panel for a programmable light bulb, so getting out of the browser into some other tech, government tax form, you'll often need to arrange groupings of content into a layout grid. It's a visual design system familiar to graphic designers that is now a staple of web designers as well. It can be done manually with floats, although as we've discovered, nobody likes floats. Clears, clear fixes, positioning, and a variety of other CSS approaches, but it takes a great deal of time, particularly when you're also required to make the layout responsive. So we need to think about that as well. So something like the F layout, what happens when your viewport goes from this size to this size? How does that layout change? Does it change? It would have to change, right, in order to be a good interface on a smaller device. So here we go. Now I'm on track. So enter Bootstrap CSS framework. This is an industry standard tool to help speed up the design. So just like the boilerplate that we looked at, it really does act as a foundation to help us rapidly develop. So a lot of that stuff that we would have to build from the ground up is done for us. And we're going to stick with Bootstrap for a couple of weeks. And what you'll find probably is that there's almost too much built into Bootstrap. But we can talk about that as we get to know Bootstrap a little bit better. So help speed up the design, development, and quality testing of more complex grid-based layouts, among other user interface patterns. That's relatively easy to use. So hopefully you agree by the end of today's lesson. So we're going to focus in particular on the responsive layout grid utilities that Bootstrap has to offer. So there's the slide I was looking for. Enter Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, it is a CSS framework or toolkit. It also involves JavaScript, and it provides a solid foundation and encourages rapid development. So let's take a look, first of all, at setting up Bootstrap. So if you want to go to, it is getbootstrap.com, and then click on the documentation. So we're going to explore the Bootstrap website for a little bit before we actually download and start messing around with Bootstrap code. All right, so Bootstrap, getting started. The documentation is pretty good. It's nice and easy to understand, pretty comprehensive. So it is the world's most popular framework for building responsive mobile-first sites. So there's a few ways to include Bootstrap. So looking to quickly add Bootstrap to your project, we're going to use the Bootstrap CDN. Who can tell me what a CDN is? What is a CDN? Yes, that's right. Do you want to try and describe what that does or what that is? It's okay if you don't. It's hard to.
Extent when it comes to how images optimize on your website.
Yeah, so a CDN is, there's different CDNs. So this is the Bootstrap CDN. What it basically does is it hosts code for us instead of us having to download the code. So you can access, jQuery has a CDN, and so instead of downloading the jQuery library, you would just include a link to the CDN, and then you have access to that code in a hosted way. So it makes it easier rather than downloading that code and hosting it ourselves. We can use the hosted version. So here is the code for the Bootstrap CDN. We're going to be using that very, very soon. We also have some, here's the jQuery CDN. There's something called Popper, and then the Bootstrap JavaScript link to that CDN. And then they have a little starter template here. So that is cool. And then a couple of other notes, just good to know. It uses the use of HTML5 doc type, which we're all using HTML5, so that's nothing new there. Responsive meta tag. So this is important. Bootstrap is mobile first. So that means they optimize code for mobile devices first. So it's focused on a smaller viewport first. So what this does is there's this responsive viewport meta tag that we need to add into the head of our document so that everything works well. And probably in the starter template, you'll see that that has been added for you. What else? Box sizing. If you didn't know this trick, this is pretty cool. Instead of having to think about padding adding to your content, if you set box sizing to content box, so the default is content box. If you set box sizing to border box, it ensures padding does not affect the final computed width of an element. So you don't have to do any math, it just magically does it for you. So that's a good trick to use in all your sites, regardless of whether you're using Bootstrap or not. It's pretty cool. It makes life a lot easier. What else? There's a community. You can follow Bootstrap on Twitter. That's pretty much it for the introduction. So let's get started with Bootstrap. Actually, before we do that, let's take a quick look at what else Bootstrap has to offer. There we go. So that's set up. Okay, so before we start to play around with Bootstrap, we're going to look at that. Just click on the next link. You can, if you open up the slides, or if you want to navigate through the site, just go to documentation and contents. It'll show you, and we'll see this too when we download the Bootstrap package. You'll see this is what is included in your Bootstrap when you download it. So this would be, instead of using the CDN, you could actually download Bootstrap and have those files actually physically as part of your project. So you can see there's multiple JavaScript files and then some CSS as well. Browsers and devices. So this talks about support. It's basically support. You don't have to worry too much about Bootstrap and not being supported, except if you are using Windows and Safari, apparently. Internet Explorer. So it talks a little bit about that. So there might be a few issues, as always, with Internet Explorer. That's good. It's also important to know about accessibility. So there's a few things that Bootstrap has done to make sure that their sites are accessible. So things like color, contrast, most colors that currently make up Bootstrap's default palette, used throughout the framework, blah, blah, blah. Oh, so that's funny. It actually leads to insufficient color contrast. So they tend to use like a lighter gray, that's not theirs, but a lighter gray, which can be hard for people with visual difficulties to see. So that's a good thing. I don't know why they wouldn't have changed that, but they do make a note of that. And so you can make sure that you change the CSS so that it does have enough contrast to be accessible. There's also something about visually hidden content. When we talk about the carousel component of Bootstrap next week, we're going to spend the whole class talking about carousels. We'll talk about the accessibility of a carousel as well. But it's always good to know that what the tools you're using, whether they are accessible, whether they are allowing you to build accessible sites, and if not, what can you do to make them accessible? All right, what else? So there's also some examples of things you can build with Bootstrap. And the cool thing is, so taking a look at this, you could just view page source, copy that code, and then use that template for your own use, right? As long as you sort of put the right sort of credentials or thank you to Bootstrap for helping you out. People would know it's Bootstrap anyway. So there are a few different templates that you can borrow and make your own. There's also an expo. So these are beautiful, inspiring uses of Bootstrap. So taking a look, apparently Super Mario Odyssey uses Bootstrap, ColorMind. These all use Bootstrap as their kind of development tool. And then lastly, there is, I think there, yeah. So this is kind of new, but you can actually buy Bootstrap themes. So if you're feeling super lazy, you can buy a Bootstrap theme for the low price of $59, and then it's all built for you, and you would just kind of change out what you need. But you guys are awesome developers, so you don't need to do that. Okay, cool. So that's it. You can also take a look at the Bootstrap blog if you want to do that, but let's actually do some stuff with Bootstrap. So first thing we're going to do is let's take a look at one of these examples. So what we're going to do is just grab or click on the album example. So how I got there, I'm on getbootstrap.com, examples, and then it doesn't really matter. You can choose any example you'd like, but I'm going to choose the first album example. Click on that, and then we're just going to view the page source and grab this stuff. Sure, sounds good. Okay, so we're just going to take a look at first the example, and then we're going to do our own custom layout with Bootstrap. So just grab that view page source, grab the code, and open up a code editor. And paste that. And so maybe just go ahead and save that as Bootstrap example, HTML.html. That is not what I wanted to do. Oh, there we go. So Bootstrap, you can really name it whatever you like, but Bootstrap-example.html makes sense to me. Now we're just going to take a look at what we've got going on here. So again, this is the code that is used to build this example here. Taking a look at this example, you can see that it is responsive. It's got kind of that grid layout that we talked about. And when you go down to, so you can either resize your viewport, or you can also emulate a mobile device. You can do that. I am in Chrome. So if I go to inspect and just click on this tiny little thing here that looks like a cell phone, we can kind of pretend we're looking at it on a mobile phone. You can also choose the type of phone. So right now I've got iPhone 6, 7, and 8. Maybe I have an iPhone X that's a little bit bigger. There we go. And so that's what it would look like on your mobile device. So pretty cool stuff. And again, it's built for you. So really nice and easy, and also helps you to rapidly develop stuff. So let's take a look. We've got our doc type at the start. We've got HTML. It has the language attribute, which is always important. And that language attribute is set before the title, which is also good practice. We have our char set. And then we've got that responsive meta set up so that it works well with mobile devices. They've even set up the description meta tag for us so we could fill that in, remembering that that is what shows up on the search engine results page. So that's what your user sees. It's a little short description of what your page or application or website is all about. You've got authors. I would leave that because those really were the authors of this. We've got generator, and then we've got our title. And then we have this rel canonical. We're going to talk about that. Canonical. I don't know how to say that word properly, but we're actually going to talk about that in the other class. So I'm not going to touch on that. That has more to do with SEO than layouts and Bootstrap. So we'll save that for another day. And then what we have here is, this is a link to the Bootstrap that the actual Bootstrap files. So what we need to do, what I'm going to do is actually switch that up so that we're connecting to the Bootstrap CDN. So if you open this file right now in your browser, it's not going to look great because we don't have access to /docs 4.3 blah blah blah. We need to instead link to the Bootstrap CDN. And that's pretty easy to do. If we go to, so it is on that Bootstrap site, but if you just Google Bootstrap CDN, and don't go to this first stack path link. I find for some reason that never works for me. Go to the second link, Introduction Bootstrap. I feel like I'm losing my voice. That's not good. And then what you want to do is just copy this link to the CDN. So first of all, we'll do the CSS. So you can just hover on that copy button and click, and that will copy that for you. And then what we're going to do is replace this where it says Bootstrap Core CSS. It's still that thing, but let's just put CDN so we remember we linked to a CDN. We're going to save that. And you can see they have some internal styles here in the head. We know that that's not great practice, so I would be tempted to move that to our custom CSS file, but we'll leave that for now. There's also a link to album CSS, so we're probably going to have to grab that too in order to fully get the layout working. But let's take a look at just connecting to that CDN. We should see hopefully an improvement in our site. Where did that go? I guess I closed it. Cool. So just by linking to the CDN, we now have access to the styles that Bootstrap provides for us. So already looking much better. And then we would do the same thing if you go all the way to the bottom, the closing, all the way to the bottom, right before the closing body tag, likely. Where is that body tag? There we go. So same thing here. We would want to include links to the CDN for the JavaScript for Bootstrap and jQuery as well. So just going back to that same page, we would want to now find JS, copy that. So that's going to give us jQuery, the popper, and Bootstrap. So we can copy that, and then right before the closing body tag, you can just, actually all those script tags can be replaced with our link to our CDN. And you won't see much of a difference visually, but we're now linked up to the right stuff. Okay, so just to recap, we just downloaded one of the examples that Bootstrap provides, and then we linked to the CDN so that we could have access to the Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript as well as jQuery and that popper thing without actually downloading all those files. So take a quick look. I'll allow you to do this on your own. See what you notice about Bootstrap. So if you've never used Bootstrap, if you're not used to it, you're probably going to say, wow, there's a lot of classes going on. That's likely one of your thoughts, maybe. But take a look at just the basic structure, look at the classes that you see, and just make any sort of observations about Bootstrap that you can see just by taking a look at the code. So I'll give you a minute to do that. I'm going to turn some lights on because it's getting a little bit too dark in here, and then we'll talk about what you see. Pardon?
I'll ask.
Okay. All right, so what do you notice about Bootstrap? If you haven't used it before, what kind of sticks out to you? Any ideas? So like I've already mentioned, you probably noticed there seems to be quite a heavy use of classes in the HTML. And that is the case with Bootstrap. So with Bootstrap, we're basically accessing sort of predefined styles through the addition of classes to our HTML. So things like, and we can actually play around with this in the browser. So let's open this up. So I'm going to look and inspect this element. Okay, so I've got a class here of Jumbotron and Text Center. So I will warn you, some of these classes are a little bit lazy, right? Like Text Center, creating a whole class just to center your text, I don't know, a bit much. But anyway, if I take this Jumbotron class out, let's see what happens. Okay, so you can see that those styles immediately go away. If I take the class Text Center out, no more centered text. So just looking at the other, so even things like text muted in the footer, where is that? Let's see what happens when we take that out. Oops. So getting rid of that class, what happens to that paragraph? I don't even know where that's kind of showing up. So what else can we play around with? Oh, maybe that's that. Okay. So that actually, here we've got button and button primary. So taking out those classes, we can see we then lose that styling for the button. So every class kind of allows us to style things in a certain way. And then the only thing to be aware of is that if you do sort of get, I don't want to say lazy, but if you rely too much on those Bootstrap styles, your site is going to look like a Bootstrap site, right? So you want to be careful. Don't rely on Bootstrap too much. Use what you need, but you don't want a very Bootstrap-looking site, which is always sort of the Jumbotron, these buttons that look exactly like that, and so on. So be careful with your use of Bootstrap. Don't make everything a Bootstrap site, but at the same time, utilize what you can that makes your life easier, right? So getting into sort of the layout, actually, I've been talking. What would you guys notice about Bootstrap other than the large amount of classes? What else kind of stands out? Yes.
The fact that all the classes seem to be pretty descriptive for CSS.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Just looking at them, you can get some idea of what each one's supposed to do.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and I never really thought about that, but you're absolutely right. So they did a good job naming their classes, so you know exactly, like when I was playing with that button, pretty clear that that's, let's look at that again. So button primary, button secondary. Button primary is going to be that blue color. Button secondary is sort of a secondary button, and then the button class is what styles a button. Same thing with Jumbotron heading, that's pretty clear. Text muted, we can guess, oh, that's what that is doing. Okay, so take that out. Let's see what happens. So I think the text got a little bit darker, maybe a darker color. So yeah, that's a really good insight that it does sort of descriptively tell you what is going to happen or what styles are going to be applied. Awesome. Anything else that comes to mind when we're looking at this Bootstrap example? Yeah, that's another good point too, which is probably driving you nuts, especially if you've had Scott as a teacher. He's always saying, don't use divs, and there's like 1 million divs in here. So that's not to say, so this is how Bootstrap did their example. We don't need to use divs. right? So not everything needs to be a div, especially something like, so we see here we have a header, and then we have sections in our header. So that could use a section tag. You don't have to use divs. We can still apply the same classes, but we can be more semantic with our code. So that's another thing to be aware of when you're using Bootstrap. That's a good point. They sort of overuse these divs where there is another more semantic tag that could be used. So yeah, good point. Anything else that comes to mind? Did anyone notice that there is some Flexbox stuff going on here? So Bootstrap, just like everything, is always changing. So the latest version of Bootstrap actually incorporates Flexbox, which is pretty cool. So you'll see things like justify content between. I think there was some mention of, let's see if something comes up, Flex. So Flexbox is incorporated in Bootstrap, so that's cool, because Flexbox now has pretty good support, whereas when it first came out, it was a little spotty. So, cool. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about the different components. The other thing, because we're focusing on layout today, there's a few classes that really have to do with building layout. So the first is container, and then row and column. So that is the basis of the Bootstrap grid. So I'll show you what happens when I take out this container class, wherever it may be. Where was it? There we go. Okay, so we can see that when we have the class of container, everything, it's set to a max width of 1140. I think it's 1170, and then there's some padding on either side. So that is, it sets it to a fixed width. There's another class, and we're going to look at this together later, but you can also say container fluid. So if we change it to container fluid, it then goes to a full width. So we have options. We can either use a fixed width of maximum 1170, and then we can just say full width, container fluid, and that's going to be 100% of whatever your viewport size is. So that's one thing. That's a big thing for creating a layout. We need to start with a container to contain everything. And then after that, we're working with rows. So here's our first row. And then you'll notice that there are columns in the row. So here's our first column, there's our second, and so on. And then we have a closing row. So let's talk more about what that is, and then we're going to build our own layout using Bootstrap. Actually, you know what? Before we get into that, let's take a break now. That's a good time to take a break. So we will take 15 minutes now, so come back at about 10 after 2, and then we will talk about containers and rows and all that stuff.
For you. I just mean as an idea. I would go with that.